Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. This month, Zez has chosen to ask me to talk about delicious things and caffeine. Zezmeril asks, for August, something simple. Coffee and tea are practically everywhere these days. We're going to put a pin in that. From your simple retail varieties to specialty brews, we're going to put a pin in that. What would you say are the best flavors for energy or enjoyment? And we're going to put a pin in that. No matter the choice, coffee is a major part for either, especially for coffee. Gonna put a pin in that. But what other properties do you think are undervalued or overvalued? You can hear that I'm going quickly, and the reason is that I already have a lot to say about this subject, quite different from previous Parley lately that are an open-ended interpretation of an image, what I have to say in response to an image that's given. This one is something that I spend a lot of time on. I think it warrants a lot of time. Coffee and tea are practically everywhere throughout human history, not just these days, but now we have a lot of options. I think that the biggest recommendation for coffee and tea is that, speaking in terms of numerical effort, humans have put a lot of work into coffee and tea. People have been addicted to caffeine, and we'll come back to that later, for thousands of years. And so you would expect that there probably is some very delicious coffee and tea. Likewise, logistically, it's beneficial for coffee and tea to taste good on their own, because throughout history, a lot of the time it would have been very inconvenient to have them with something else. It wouldn't be a matter of whether you preferred your coffee or tea with milk, let's say. You simply didn't have milk. And so the better it could taste, plain, black, as it were, with coffee, that would be beneficial. There would be a reason that would have been pursued for thousands of years. And from the perspective of a lot less scientific regulation and people not measuring the temperature of their water and stuff, it must have seemed like it took a lot of expertise to make coffee or tea taste good on their own. I don't think it does nowadays, by the way. I think it's pretty easy. It doesn't really require much skill to make delicious tasting coffee or tea. You can apply more skill and get a better result in some situations. I'm not saying it's skillless or that like the World Barista Championship isn't a competition that involves skill at all. No. But you, and I am talking to you specifically, dear listener, could make very delicious coffee or tea, especially tea, at the end of this video. And so I hope to encourage people to enjoy this thing more. We need to set a couple of ground rules. The big one is that I'm not trying to tell you that what you like is wrong. I don't think I'm going to sound like that throughout this parlay, but I want you to know that I don't think that. The only purpose of this answer, the way I'm giving it, is to hopefully help you enjoy something that you enjoy more. If you like something different or you don't like something, that's okay. That's fine. Like, I'm not trying to tell you your thing is wrong. I don't think that. I'm not just being polite. I genuinely think like that thing is good. I think, for example, Starbucks commonly makes coffee flavored confection beverages, kind of dessert drinks with coffee. For this video, it's going to be very unhelpful to refer to that as just coffee. It's literally not. A lot of people do. That's fine, whatever. To them, their morning coffee, they mean it's like a frappuccino. Perfectly fine. For this discussion, that's quite unhelpful. We're going to say coffee is just coffee. It should be obvious in the context of this topic. And this Starbucks thing is a coffee-flavored beverage. I don't mean that means it's like bad or lesser. It's something completely different. It's really not the same thing as what we're talking about with coffee and tea. It's a thing using that as an ingredient. Perfectly fine, delicious, in my opinion, a bit sweet for me, but still good tasting, but not the same thing. That's not to say that it's bad or wrong. It's just not very helpful to say it's the same. Is that cool? At the same time, over here, ground rule number 2, in this video, I'm going to suggest that statistically, if you think you don't like one of the things we're talking about, statistically, you probably just had a bad version of it. If you think you don't like black tea is a huge category of tea. You probably just had a relatively low quality black tea, and black tea can not only be a very delicious version of that flavor that you might like or might not. You know that flavor, and maybe making it better wouldn't be something you'd like. But black tea could also taste like a lot of other things. Black tea is not a very useful category, really. A lot of these categories come from marketing. They're not really useful to you. They're just things that make it easier to sell a product. and thinking of them as, I'm trying to taste just tea. I don't like the whole category of black tea. That is quite unlikely. Like, probably not. You just probably haven't had the black teas that are way different than those other black teas. That's okay. It's not like bad or wrong to feel like you don't want to go try those things. But for this conversation, I would like to politely suggest that you should let go of feeling the need to say you know that you do or don't like these things, because you don't, statistically. I don't. I don't know what I feel about black tea. I think I do. I would say I don't really like black tea that much, but I don't know that. I'm not really qualified to say that. How would I know that? I haven't had like so much of the black tea there is. It might be very practical, usually, to say like, all right, but most black tea, whatever, whatever. Yeah, but for the purpose of this parlay, for the duration of this parlay, I would like to humbly ask that you abandon that temporarily, and maybe there could be something really fun for you that I could introduce. I don't have as much experience as many other people do, but I do have a broad experience, just not a very deep experience with a lot of different types of coffee and tea. I've tried almost everything. I just haven't tried a lot of almost anything. So, but in the grand scheme of things, maybe I'm not the worst person to do this. Sure. Okay, is that cool? I'm not trying to tell you like haven't. I know it can be very frustrating to hear people say like, but you don't know how you feel about that thing. I'm only politely suggesting that perhaps there's just a lot of bad coffee and tea, relatively bad coffee or tea. And if you enjoy those things, you could really enjoy these things. And if you don't enjoy those things, you might actually be able to share in this thing a lot of people enjoy if you had these ones instead. That's all. I'm not trying to tell you that I decide how you feel about your thing. That is wrong, and I'm not trying to say that. So I feel this is very important. I feel like I'm harping this point. I think it matters a lot. I feel like people do people dirty with this subject in a lot of areas, not just coffee and tea and tasting. But I really don't want you to feel like that's an attack on you. That's all. Okay. So coffee and tea. I have a couple of stories to frame this discussion. First one is about Starbucks. I don't like Starbucks. I'm not saying I don't like their coffee necessarily, although I don't like their coffee. I do like their coffee flavored beverage thing. It's a bit sweet for me, I said, but that's fine. Starbucks is just kind of a nasty business. I feel like people sort of know this, so sorry for going over it again. But I have a fun story about it. Yeah, Starbucks will often, open a coffee shop near a specialty or a small family-owned coffee shop or whatever, kind of knowing that their Starbucks store they opened will need to shut down, but it puts the small coffee shop out of business. And then the Starbucks store is happy to just close up and lay off the employees and end up getting more market share, which is predatory and an abuse of their financial privilege. And that's bad. And I've had a lot of friends who've been laid off in that way for that reason. And it feels like, what was this for? Like, I was used as a financial instrument to bankrupt a small business. Like, what? Stop. Like, that's evil. Obviously, they're evil. That being said, also very funny. Now, the taste of coffee and milk together can be very delicious. Darker roasted coffee has this bitter, often chocolatey body that is probably what most people think of as all the taste of coffee. Very light roasted coffees have I think, usually totally alien flavor. I'm not sure they taste much like that at all. They might not even be recognizable as coffee to people that weren't told it was coffee before trying it. But anyway, and that flavor, that dark chocolate kind of bitter flavor, stands up very well to milk, dairy alternative, whatever, and can taste very delicious. Now, the roasting process alone will create that flavor on a coffee bean. It's kind of a darkened carbon flavor. Anything but the absolute lowest quality tasting coffee would taste like that if you roasted it dark. So Starbucks mostly serves that type of coffee. They do not need their coffee to taste really good. That isn't valuable to them as a business. People who are going to Starbucks to drink black coffee think that black coffee never tastes good. It's just bitter and unpleasant, and the people who like it are just being tough or like toxic masculine or something. That's not true, but it appears that way to those people over there. A common theme in this parlay is going to be keeping in mind that the other side looks quite stupid from where you're standing, and they're not. There is some good thing over there. The coffee flavored beverages are delicious, and black coffee can be very delicious, very beautiful. The people who don't think black coffee can be delicious think I'm talking about coffee I don't like when I say I like black coffee. I'm talking about this thing, not that thing. Anyway, Starbucks trains their employees, and you pull shots of espresso, and espresso is good because you get a metal filtered, rich bodied, concentrated shot of coffee, they always say. And this will then be diluted with milk and sugar and delicious things. And that will stand up really well to those flavors, and you'll still get that kind of chocolatey mocha body, which can be quite tasty. So espresso, extracting the coffee with 9 bars of pressure or so through a metal filter, pretty high dose to a relatively low yield. That is what I mean when I say espresso here. Is a very good tool in this case. Starbucks teaches its employees that if you make a shot of espresso and you don't get it into your fat, your dairy, your milk alternative, within 15 seconds or so, the shot kind of dies and tastes awful. Now, it just tastes awful. The thing is that for those first 15 seconds, it's too hot. You can't taste it. So if somebody were to order a shot of espresso and just take it like a shot, it would probably be so hot they wouldn't notice that it does taste truly awful. It would taste bitter or whatever, but all espresso would taste like that at that temperature. If you wait a little bit, it could taste delicious if you like a shot of espresso, which not everyone does, but theirs does not. And of course, they're not going to tell people our coffee tastes bad. It's perfectly fine that their coffee doesn't taste that good. It doesn't make sense to focus on that in the way they're using it, but it doesn't. And so indeed, they have kind of created this lie where chemically it goes bad if you don't put it in milk soon enough. That is not a real thing that happens, but they say that it is, which I think is very funny and embarrassing. That's a parody of themselves. Again, likewise with black tea, is kind of a framing story. It can be hard to recommend black tea to people if you have some different black tea, for example. In the United States, we're kind of marketed teas a certain way. I think partially because of coffee, black tea sounds stronger. Now, black tea is often roasted. That incinerates some caffeine. So just like darker roasted coffee, black tea is technically a little bit weaker in terms of caffeine. 10 to 20% is an estimate. Maybe not that significant, but it's not stronger, if anything. There's no way to say it's really stronger, but people mean a taste when they say stronger a lot of the time. It's just important to remember that people don't mean the same thing by those words. If someone says they like their coffee strong, really, if you intend to make them happy, you should ask them what they mean by strong. Do you mean a higher concentration of coffee in the drink, or do you mean a darker tasting drink? Those are not the same thing. If you make a high concentration light roasted coffee, it won't taste strong, meaning like dark roasted, but it is absolutely it will taste like a strong drink in some way, just not what they meant. Anyway, the confusion of terms thing. I think that's enough framing. The point is, please just keep in mind that these terms are often mostly used for marketing. I was told in the United States that white tea is generally lighter. It sounds lighter. It's not. Of course, being that it isn't roasted, technically white tea usually has a little bit more caffeine than other forms of tea, let alone that the amount of caffeine is not necessarily what strength means. That's as if to imply that people are only drinking the thing because of caffeine. Anyway, they're not. And we'll talk about caffeine kind of later. For now, tea recommendations. Yeah. First of all, I think that tea is in some ways kind of a better place to start. The reason I think this is because you can brew it with pretty whatever equipment, and it will taste good. It doesn't require precise extraction in the same way that coffee does. I don't fully know why. I think it's because the taste of coffee is a balance of its various flavor extracts, like the acid that's in all coffee and the bitterness that's in all coffee, balancing to make up that flavor that is whatever that coffee tastes like. So you do need to extract it carefully, a regular grind size, high temperature water, a certain amount of brew time. These things relatively matter in coffee. They don't matter as much as sometimes they appear to. You can be somewhat loosey-goosey with those things and have good tasting coffee. But in tea, you can be a lot more open with them. And I think the reason is because the flavor isn't an equilibrium of tastes. It's like just the amount of extraction you get. So it's okay to just put some loose leaf tea leaves in, hot water and extract the thing. Now, one of the other things I wanted to get back to was, as you said, no matter the choice, caffeine is a major part for either, especially for coffee. Now, tea contains more caffeine by a lot. It's just that when people make coffee, they use a lot more of it, usually. It's common, though, to make tea by putting a lot of tea in a little water for a short time, pouring that out, drinking it, and then doing that many more times. Often called gongfu, kung fu, Eastern brewing. But I'm going to describe the brewing methods rather than referring to them because I think those names are somewhat unhelpful. Western brewing being the thing where you put relatively less tea in a lot of water, like a tea bag, for example. Not that you couldn't brew the Eastern one with a tea bag, but anyway. And that way of making tea gives you a lot of caffeine because you're using a more similar amount of tea to the amount of coffee you used when you make coffee, and tea has more caffeine usually. So it's important to keep in mind that that is not necessarily a quality of the beverages. In the caffeine section, I'm going to make the point about, you could take a caffeine pill, and why don't people do that? And maybe thinking about caffeine a bit differently would be useful, but we'll get to that a little later. Drinking tea, the way I drink tea, is a lot of caffeine, and that's something to manage. It makes a lot of tea. It's a good thing to share. Historically, tea brewed in these small batches, I'll get my setup for that, was used as a conversation point because it does require a lot of very simple motor movements, a bit of fiddling with the things. Now that could be considered a positive. That's not a bad thing. You could make something that required less fiddling, but why? It's easier to do this with basic pottery, which is what they would have had at the time. Not that they didn't have beautiful pots, just to say they weren't making these like complicated factory-made cast, things that brew tea in this maybe more simplified way. It was easier to just make a beautiful pot and say, hey, maybe I'll brew some tea out of that, And so why complicate it? The brewer I use a lot of the time is this little guy. This is a Japanese style one. Technically, it's called a hoin. You can see that it's got a lid with a little hole so it doesn't, plug up. It's got some grooves in there. Those are kind of a strainer, help keep the tea leaves from flowing out when you cap it, like this, and then you'd, pour your fluid out. You can see a lot of stuff would get strained out there. And I'm generally pouring into a fairness pitcher, these are called. Fairness for a few reasons. Fairness because then you can pour it into individual cups and share it, but also fairness because you're concentrating the tea so highly, different parts of the time you're pouring over 10 seconds or whatever actually have different extraction levels. So evening them out by combining them is useful. You can see I've got a strainer here too that you can just take out. And then I'd pour it into a cup. This cup is probably a topic for another time, but cups, that's a whole rabbit hole that we're not getting into now. You didn't really ask about that. The point is, I'm just brewing tea by putting it in this thing and then straining it like you do with pasta water, You could brew it in a cooking pot or like take a jar, I don't know, and put a lid on it, and you don't really need any equipment for this. If you go buy some nice tea and you brew it this way with the right amount of time and just boiling water, it will taste good, like pretty much as good as this. You can see that because I've used this teapot a lot, it has a pretty extensive patina, a lot of minerals that have stuck onto the outside. So my tea tastes a bit different coming out of this, sure. And there is that whole rabbit hole we're not getting into right now about the cups, nope, story for another time. No, I'm not going to do it. Stop, don't try to talk about that right now. We don't have the time. But the point is, you can very easily make delicious tea that way. The thing about tea that is kind of a divergence from coffee is that higher quality tea will yield more tea. So in some way, if you don't buy ridiculously expensive tea, you do get what you pay for a bit more just in terms of volume. So I think that tea is a very good, you want to dig into this thing I've been talking about a bit. I'm recommending buying some nice tea leaves, some nice loose leaf tea leaves, and brew them this way. Get them in, a vessel. It doesn't really matter what. You can buy a, reasonable looking teapot like that for not that much money. Go on Etsy. There's a bunch of potters selling those. There's plenty of other places to buy them, but anyway. And pour boiling water on the loose leaf leaves. Start with, I don't know, 5 grams to 150 milliliters ish. It depends a lot on the tea. Maybe 5 grams to 100 milliliters. I don't know, something like that. Do a small amount. You measure it with a scale. You have a kitchen scale. You can buy one for like $10 on the internet. So get a scale. It doesn't have to have a timer. You all have phones. I don't know why people like timers on their scales so much. That's weird to me. I don't recommend that. Just get a whatever $10 scale. That's what I use. It's perfectly accurate. I don't think I would benefit from having something else. It's just a dinky little scale. And you can use it for coffee too. We'll talk about that a little later. And you can put your tea on it and go for like 30-ish seconds and then pour it out. Again, you may wish to have some kind of straining layer. You could pour it through a coffee filter if that's what you had. I would rinse the coffee filter first because it might have a lot of papery taste. We'll talk about that later. Yeah, and that will be good. You should be able to go like 5 to 8 times depending on the tea. That will yield, over a liter of tea. For what is the amount of tea that a tea bag contains, out of which you were normally getting, brewed with a lot of water, just that one tea bag, only about half as much tea. So you are getting a much higher yield of better tasting tea. The problem, of course, is that we need to now get into the particular tastes. The problem, I think, with high quality coffee and tea is that they start to try to taste weird instead of good at a certain point. For example, I mentioned earlier how it's frustrating how black tea is kind of treated like one thing when that's really not that useful. It's just roasted tea. You would expect there to be many flavors that would exhibit. Why categorize them all that way? I don't like the flavor of a lot of commercial black teas because they taste mostly the same. But there's lots of black teas that don't taste much like that at all. So somebody very near and dear to me who sends me tea a lot, well, she sent me a whole set of black teas. Here's some of them. She uses these recycled hair product containers. And one of them is this pretty normal tasting guy. It's malty, tastes kind of milkshakey. It has some chocolate. It's not that different from a medium roasted coffee. It looks like that. Great smell. Smells like malted milk balls. If you've had Whoppers, not sponsored. Whoppers, for example, that kind of flavor. What other malted? Some chocolate bars have this kind of flavor as well. Anyway, very nice. A bit desserty smelling. Not sweet or anything. It's not sweetened. It's just tea leaves, but they have been cultivated in such a way that they have that flavor about them. But over here, I have this one. This one is an artificial, engineered, deliberately made cultivar of tea called Ruby Black. And it looks like this, pretty normal looking. It looks darker roasted, which means nothing if you've been paying attention, if you've been taking notes. It smells like nothing, absolutely nothing. Like maybe the faintest, like you spilled red wine on the carpet a day ago, and then you go in the room, but I'm reaching. Like there's this very slightest like fruit, like red fruit smell, but very, very faint. This tea said in its tasting notes that it tastes of camphor. Camphor is a flammable wax. Why are you trying to tell people that to tell people how it tastes? Why is that useful? No, it's not. For reasons that we won't get into here, I have actually tasted camphor before, and it does taste of camphor. When you drink it, there's very little on the whole body, and then at the end, as you swallow it, there's a distinct, like, kind of medicinal, kind of chemically, not in a terrible way, but not in a good way, camphor note, or like resin or acetone a little bit. It's not good. It's not disgusting, but who wants that? I don't know who's that for, but in any case, utterly alien to the other flavor I was talking about, like not even the same universe from that flavor. So to say that both of these are black tea, like it's not useful for deciding what tea to get, really, in my opinion. Tasting notes are also often marketing. Why did they say their tea tastes like camphor? Why are they being such edgelords about the taste of the tea? Well, it's for marketing. I mean, they're trying to suggest that this is going to be a very unique experience, which it was. The tasting notes weren't useless, but the exact taste, like, especially for most tea and coffee that has less weird tasting notes, it's just kind of random. I mean, I've had a tea with a tasting note that was like uh, apricot jam, which that's kind of normal. I have a coffee with a tasting note. This is apricot tea. Do you mean like you take dried apricots and then you decoct them? And then that flavor is the flavor of the what? What? Like, why? Stop. That's not a useful tasting note. Or melon marmalade. People do not make marmalade out of melons in the country where that coffee is being sold. Like, that's not a good tasting note. Like, why? It's for marketing. That being said, it does give you a general idea. The apricot tea thing, they're just being obnoxious. But okay, apricot, so like stone fruit. It's going to have a stone fruit taste. And you would come to know that. That's a common tasting note in a lot of coffee. Melon marmalade. Stop it. But okay, like fruit, kind of tropical fruit, but you're suggesting it's going to be kind of chill, like not too funky. Sweet? Is this coffee going to be heavy on sweetness? It was. It wasn't very acidic, bright, delicious, potentially acidity. I'm not talking about sour coffee. Acidity, fresh, delicious, crisp. It wasn't like that much, and it wasn't very bitter, chocolatey, maybe not horribly acrid and burnt tasting like some bad dark roasted coffee, but bitter, that delicious flavor. It wasn't those things. It was this kind of sweetness, natural sweetness of coffee that was really nice. Again, not with added sugar or anything. People always confuse that. But coffee can taste very naturally sweet, and that coffee was like that. The takeaway is that these tasting notes can be very useful for general associations. I would almost completely ignore the specific things they're describing. Sometimes you'll get something similar. One thing I love about this near and dear to me person, she removes the tasting notes. She'll buy the tea and then she splits it. Some for me in this, she mails it to me, and then some for her, but the tasting notes aren't here. So like we both buy from this website. I can go look them up if I want, but nobody wants that really. And so you get to taste it without knowing, it's going to taste like camphor. Like, shut up. It does actually, but I don't really want to hear that before let it be a surprise. Occasionally, again, sometimes they have a very specific one. I once had a coffee that said it had a cedar tasting note, like the tree cedar, which of course my immediate reaction was, that sounds disgusting, but like, really? It does? You didn't just put it next to some car freshener or something? And indeed, the coffee did have a kind of cedary car freshener tasting note. It was not good. It wasn't disgusting. It was not overpowering, but not good. It was kind of a novelty. Again, I really want to highlight that thing about that one tea I mentioned with camphor, and the thing I was saying earlier. You want to be careful with these specialty coffees and teas. They begin to pursue novelty over deliciousness at a certain point. I wouldn't pay a lot of money for your coffee and tea. I wouldn't pay no money either. To give you a quick example, the kind of benchmark I have for like what is a reasonable amount of money to pay for these things, for like a high quality one, but that isn't being masturbatory with its weirdness, would be for coffee. It's much easier. In the United States, we're talking you're expecting to pay for most bags of coffee are about the same size. At the grocery store, good-ish quality coffee that is now stale, we'll talk about that later, would be like maybe $8, like $5 to $8. You're expecting to pay maybe $15 to $18 for this bag of really good quality, but not like stupidly weird coffee. Again, that's fine. It can be fun. It's okay to like that kind of coffee. I have fun with it sometimes, but it's not really trying to be good. Like, I don't think the people who made it even think like this is so delicious. It's just like how particular. It's so particular. That can be fun. I don't know if I'd buy that regularly, but that coffee could be much more expensive. $15 to $18, that realm. And the thing is about good extraction methods in coffee, that they kind of mirror the tea making more tea thing. Good quality coffee won't make you more coffee, but good coffee brewing will make you more coffee. You can extract the coffee more efficiently. It's not as big of a difference as in tea. but you can definitely make up the difference. For perspective, some of you who buy coffee regularly and have translated that price into how much you pay for coffee might be thinking for like 350, grams of coffee, it seems like 15 or 18 bucks is really expensive compared to what you pay. But for perspective, my normal recipe is about 8 grams of coffee to 150 milliliters of water, and that yields a stronger coffee than what most people get out of like a pour over machine or something. Not very, highly concentrated, but a bit more concentrated. It's arguably more coffee for the coffee. And you can see how 350 grams in a bag, 8 grams per time I make coffee, that's a lot. That means over the month, each cup of coffee is like 50 cents or something. You could calculate it out, but just as an example, it's really not expensive. It might be more expensive, and only your financial situation that way. Now, the thing about coffee that we're going to have to get into is the grinding setup. With tea, yeah, you have your tea, and then you could just kind of put it in something and pour usually boiling water over it. Not for every kind of tea, but a lot of kinds of tea. It's suitable to brew with boiling water. And then dump it out after a certain amount of time. Like, you don't really need equipment, and even the equipment isn't that expensive. You just buy a nice teapot for like $30 to $50 on, again, Etsy, for example. There are plenty of beautiful teapots that way. A good gift if you want to do this with someone. It's a good thing to do with a couple. That can be fun. But for coffee, you gain so much by grinding your coffee fresh. If you buy pre-ground coffee, it will be vacuum sealed a lot of the time, and that will be fine for the first few, but you won't be able to get through much of it before most of it loses a lot of its flavor aromatics, and you're brewing perfectly safe to drink, but vastly inferior coffee. Again, in the grand scheme of things, buying an $150 Baratza Encore, or like, what's it called, the Wilfa Svart? There's another really good entry-level grinder. These are electric grinders that are entry-level, but make great tasting coffee. They have a good enough consistency of a grind that your coffee won't taste muddy and unclear. It will taste specific. You'll be able to taste the specific things in the coffee. It will taste good. Even to people that have some fancy grinder, they'll think, like, that tastes good. $150 might sound like a lot. Now, if you're using it every day, that really isn't that much, in my opinion. Like, if you use this more than most things you own, for a computer, we're not upset that that's like $500 to $1,500 because it's something that is the focal point of many of our professional lives. I think this is the same thing, but that's still a big upfront cost. And I don't think you should do that if you don't even know if you will enjoy like high quality, well brewed black coffee. That's just frustrating, right? In a way that tea really isn't. You don't need the same equipment to make a nice, even extraction. So you could just buy some good quality tea for like 10 bucks and try it and have a lot of it and have a great time. And then you can get more if you want. Whereas for coffee, there's this entry cost. In the grand scheme of things, not really that expensive, in my opinion. But initially, if you don't like it, you don't know if you like it, that's not good, right? Keeping in mind, you've got your grinder, but then you also need something to brew with. And I do think a lot of the better coffee brewers are, okay, like 30 bucks. It's like the teapot, I guess. But you kind of need those, whereas you don't need them, but they're very helpful, whereas you sort of don't need something with tea. Personally, I would highly recommend getting an AeroPress. This is not a complicated thing. You put your tea in this plunger guy, and you're gonna cap it so the water doesn't fall through, and it'll be filtered. You'll put a paper filter in here. The filter is really small, so you get to save time not rinsing it. And then you can slowly plunge, and you get a nice even cup of coffee. The coffee and the water hang out together for the whole time. They're not constantly flowing through. It matters a lot less how the coffee is ground exactly. It's a very forgiving way to brew. It has very good thermal retention, so you don't have to preheat it. It just removes a lot of annoyances with brewing while being virtually indestructible and not very expensive. Additionally, because the parts are relatively modular, your plunger cap thing, this rubber bit, gets damaged, you could just order a new one off their website for like $5 or something. Again, you need to new just the plunger. You need to new just the shower head. You can buy those individually. I think this brew is pretty much the end of the conversation in terms of like, you don't know what to get this, and then maybe get other stuff too. I don't think it's pointless to get other coffee brewers, but this is far and away like the entry level deity in my opinion. The cleanup is ridiculously easy. I'm not even going to tell you about it. Just when you first clean up your AeroPress, you finish plunging and then you push through the rest of the way, and that puck of coffee pops out of here, and you're like done. You just run this under the faucet and rub it off, and you're done. Amazing, like masterpiece. So good. This brew is popular for a reason. It's perfect in my opinion. Solves so many problems that other brewers have. Makes delicious coffee. I don't actually brew the normal way around. I usually brew inverted, where you put the coffee and the water in here, coffee in, water in, leave it for a bit, cap it, and then you're going to flip it. A little bit will come out, but people say this is dangerous, and I personally kind of disagree. And then you plunge, and I prefer that for a variety of reasons. But the truth is I've done them both a lot, and there isn't a very big difference. I think there are some very minor benefits to doing this that we could talk about sometime, but it doesn't really matter. There is a confusingly little difference, actually. Anyway, but the upfront cost thing. And so here's where I will actually recommend a thing to you. I am not sponsored by this thing, but I do think it's a service that solves a problem in a way that you wouldn't probably understand why that would seem worthwhile until this point in the conversation, until we've established, you know, you could get these teas and just brew them, and that'd be great. For coffee, there is this more upfront cost, and you do get less of a benefit in terms of how much of it you get by buying more expensive coffee. Personally, I think it's easier to taste the differences between coffee than the differences in similar kinds of tea. There's more of a breadth of tastes in tea, but if I have two teas that are similar, but this one is, you know, it is a different tea, I think it's harder to taste the difference between them than with coffees. So I find it more rewarding to buy a different tasting coffee, personally. I like both, but you do get more coffee for your money by buying the more expensive coffee. And there's the upfront cost of the grinders and stuff, and that's not good. So I do have a recommendation. If you're in the United States and you want to try some delicious black coffee, I think you should buy Cometeer once. Cometeer is not sponsored, a service that flash freezes concentrated filter coffee. So it's, you know, it's not sedimenty. It's very clear, like you'd make a normal cup of coffee in a brewing machine or whatever, or in my AeroPress. But it's fairly concentrated. It's a little puck, they call them comets, of nitrogen frozen coffee. And the idea here is it's frozen quickly. It doesn't damage the aromatic organic compounds in the coffee as much. If you freeze coffee normally, it will taste kind of bad, and I guess that's why. The ice crystals are damaging those flavor molecules. It tastes bad. I think that's why. I don't know. This tastes much better. They have a fancy grinder and everything, so it's immaculately scientifically brewed. You're getting something that you don't have to worry that you're taking the guesswork out of. Is this supposed to taste as good as it can? Yes. Then it's just a matter of, do you like it? You know? And they have different roast levels you can pick. You can't pick individual coffees, which is a bummer, but you can say light, medium, or dark. I said earlier, a frustration of mine is roasters not really being clear about what they mean by these terms. Again, black tea, white tea, dark roasted coffee, strong coffee, kind of doesn't mean anything. And one frustration I have with Cometeer is that their roast levels kind of don't mean anything, in my opinion. I'll tell you a little anecdote about that in just a sec to explain what I mean. But the good thing about Cometeer is that it's expensive. Like, you're paying, you know, $45 for your box of 36, 32, you know, comets, little coffee pucks. 24? 32. It's 32. Sorry. And that might seem like a lot. Now, it is only like $1 or whatever per cup of coffee with the discount. It's not that expensive, especially if you buy coffee out. And you're just going to dilute this with hot water. That's what I'm going to recommend, so you can try them black. You can use them for lattes and stuff. You can melt them very quickly. That's delicious too. If you like that, you might really enjoy this product. That's fine. You might buy this month to month. I'm not really recommending that here. No, really what I'm suggesting is that you can get this once as a way to not need to guess about whether the coffee at this random coffee shop you're going to, it might just not be that good, or the person making it that day might just not make it as effectively. A lot of places also just won't make you a filter coffee because it takes too long for their business workflow. It's just not a viable business decision. This would be a good way to try this thing and see if you like it. And then you could invest in a pretty cheap grinder that over the long term won't cost you very much. I've had that one for 2 years and it's still going great. No signs of wear and tear really. So at that point, you might feel more comfortable saying, I like this. I drink coffee in the morning anyway. Now I'll go get this equipment and I'll take Zandy's word for it. I hope you will. To get, you don't need to go crazy on the grinder to start out with. Get an $150-ish electric grinder. It'll be fine. This will be fine. Get a Baratza Encore, not sponsored. Or a Wilfa Svart, I think that's what it's called, not sponsored. It's fine. And then buy an AeroPress, not sponsored. But you don't have to leap before you look. There is that service. I think Cometeer is valuable because of that unique upfront cost in coffee that can be really frustrating. Now, since I recommended it, a quick disclaimer about Cometeer before I talk about caffeine a little bit at the end. I said I think Cometeer's roast levels are not very helpful, not really the thing. Yeah, so what I mean is, I had a coffee from Cometeer, all not sponsored all over this. It was a George Howell coffee. It was Dota French. Dota is the canton in Costa Rica, which is where the coffee's from. French, they mean French roast, which kind of means dark roast. I'm oversimplifying here for the sake of time. It doesn't really matter, because I drank that, and it was incredible, very tasty. One of my favorite coffees from them. My folks buy Cometeer regularly, so they had a lot of it. And they were buying the dark roasted box. And this Dota French coffee was in it a few times, and it was really good. But I was drinking it, and I thought, this doesn't taste like the ashy, a little bit burnt, but like deep dark chocolate flavors of coffee. It doesn't taste like that. None of these dark roasted pods actually taste like that. So I went to georgehowell.com or whatever, and I bought the beans for Dota French. This is a thing you can do with Cometeer. They're buying the beans in bulk from small roasters, small, medium, large roasters. And you could go buy those same coffee beans. They'll be named, something similar. So I bought the Dota French beans, and they arrived, and I looked at them. And yeah, they're not a dark color. They're in the middle. Both George Howell and Cometeer say dark, the darkest they say a thing is. But in the grand scheme of coffee roasting, that is medium-ish. We're even being a bit generous there, in my opinion. They're kind of objectively not dark roasted. That's what I'm trying to say. Now, I've said throughout this parlay, I think it's important to pair apart terms with these things. And this is another case like that. To some extent, okay, it's darker. If you want something dark tasting, this is what they have on offer. You like it or you don't. Fine. I'm not sure there's a need to not make that clear. Why couldn't they just say light, medium, and medium roasted? Well, then people will think they don't have anything on offer that's dark roasted, but they kind of don't. I don't know. I don't know. And then the supermarket coffees, not all supermarket coffees are terrible or anything. Just because the coffee's in a supermarket doesn't make it bad, but a lot of them are. A lot of them are stale. Because the supermarket doesn't want them to say how fresh it is, because then people think, oh, it's a month old, versus I have 6 months to drink it. Yeah, it's food safe for 6 months. But anyway, okay. I'm sorry. There's a lot to say. We're not going to get to all of it. But the point is, those coffees often say how strong they are instead of level of roast. They're using the meaning of strength. That is like how dark roasted the coffee is. Now, they're not going to try to sell you a coffee that's weak, because that's how they've put it, of course. And indeed, the lighter of those coffees is kind of just the medium roasted coffee in the grand scheme of things. I think we could just show the color of the coffee bean. And if it's going to be a light roasted coffee, that shit should be blonde. Like, okay, let's make that mean something. And then light, medium, dark, darkest. Those could mean things, that could be meaningful. But when people say, again, like the tasting notes, saying it's a French roast, like you mean to you it means those things, or you think that will sell well. That's not really that helpful. So, as a quick disclaimer, I'd really encourage you not to focus that much on that. In tea, maybe to not focus that much on, like, is it a pu'er tea? Is it aged? Is it an oolong? That's a huge category that really doesn't mean that much. If you tried every tea and you don't like any of them, then I guess you probably don't like any oolong. Fine. I'm not sure that person is existing, but anyway, I'm just not sure that's that meaningful. What I do think is helpful is what maybe where it's from. For coffee, that can be kind of helpful. I have yet to dislike a good quality coffee from Costa Rica that I've tried. When I say good quality, I mean, you know what farm it's from. The reason that is an indicator is because it's expensive to track exactly where the coffee came from. They won't invest the money in that if the coffee doesn't have genuine value that tastes good, that warrants that extra investment from consumers for consumers. If they're not going to show you, where it's from, you're expecting something a little less good. So it's a kind of a catch-22 or a self-fulfilling prophecy a bit. But it is broadly true that the more traceable your coffee or your tea is, the better it's going to taste, broadly speaking, because it costs money to get that information from point A to point B. If the coffee or tea tasted the same as another coffee or tea, why would it be worth the effort to track that information? Does that make sense? But obviously, that's only a rule of thumb. You can never really objectify. There's so many people who could not be clear in that process. So I don't know. But place can be helpful for coffee. I found that helpful. Processing method, very helpful. Was it roasted, the tea? How dark was it roasted, the coffee? Again, mostly the color of the bean. You will begin to learn, like, what is that dark roasted flavor of coffee? What is the signature light roasted flavor of coffee, regardless of what they say? For coffee, you might look at processing method, washed coffee, natural coffee, honey processed coffee, etc. That is very helpful broadly. Particularly, a lot of people are set off by the fermenty flavors of like a natural coffee. You should find out if that's you. That will take some effort. Cometeer has a lot of natural processed coffees, so that's a fairly good way to do that, actually. I wouldn't write it off too quick. There's a wide variety of naturals, but some people, I think genetically, there's something that sets them off. So there may not be nothing you can do. Wow. For tea, yeah, like the part of the tea, I've consistently really liked twig or kukicha, it's called in Japanese. Twig tea and bud teas. I've frequently really enjoyed. Leaves are most teas, and that's perfectly fine, but I happen to know that I frequently like the taste profile of that part of the tea plant, no matter how it's processed. Lighter, younger age teas, younger pu'er, sometimes gives me a headache. I kind of know that now. So it's not that I don't like them, but something to keep in mind. And I find that stuff all a lot more helpful than what the tasting notes say. It often feels like nonsense, or like is it a white tea? Is it a black tea? Like a lot of these, their goal is to be different. So that like they're trying to make that unhelpful information. I would recommend not focusing on that so much. I think that's it. I recommended a way you could approach the tea thing and the coffee thing, fairly different ways. What exact website? There are just so many. If you really want a specific recommendation, here's the thing. You DM me on Discord, and I will personally briefly talk you through, you say some drinks you like or some tea you've liked. Anything about it. You can know very little about it, that's fine. Anything you can tell me. And I will personally recommend a specific tea or coffee or whatever that you could buy if you like. I'd be happy to do that. I'm sure nobody will actually use that service. But if you are the one person who will, I really will be happy to do that. That's fine. Please go ahead. You can find my Discord. Most of you already know where my Discord is. Help each other if someone is looking for it, but it should be easy to find. I'd be happy to do that. I usually, when I say these things, no one does, and that's fine. Maybe I gave you enough information anyway, but I'd be happy to help. Okay, caffeine, briefly. I kind of talked about it throughout a little bit. I do feel that a lot of the reason that people drink coffee and tea when they don't like them that much is because they want caffeine, but it would be uncomfortable to act like they had an addiction to caffeine, which they do. And so they're not going to take caffeine pills, but really they should just get off caffeine. This is going to be very cynical. I'm a person who's not affected by the stimulating effects of caffeine. So, what I'm here to talk about is mostly you should think about whether it's important for you to have caffeine all the time if you don't want to have these things. Also, the amount of caffeine in these things. And finally, some other effects of caffeine that most people, I reckon, probably don't experience because they usually don't have enough caffeine for it to be clear that that is what is happening. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. Okay, so yes, the caffeine thing. You know, a lot of people drink caffeine in the morning. They drink some coffee in the morning. They say they can't function without coffee in the morning. But it takes like 10 or 15 minutes for the caffeine to affect you. And people tend to kind of feel better right away a lot of the time. Not everyone, but a lot of people. It's the ritual, it's placebo. These things have power. It's not bad to drink coffee that hopefully you like the taste of. That also has a useful effect. And there's a lot of studies showing that in moderation, caffeine can be healthy. Coffee can be quite healthy. Tea can be quite healthy in moderation. So I'm not saying that's bad, by the way. That being said, you should find out what you feel like when you are not drinking caffeine. It will take a little while. The first few days you'll get some headaches. You can wean off it, and it's a lot easier to wean off it if you make it yourself because you can control the dose more accurately. If you don't brew single cups of coffee yourself, it might be quite hard to get. You could just literally drink less coffee, I guess, but you can make a specific amount that is like the exact amount you want. Some larger automatic brewers do not let you make a good tasting cup of coffee that is small, so you may be unable to do this without wasting some, which maybe you're fine with. You get the point. So there's some utility there, sure. Tea, of course, has L-theanine in it, which is a compound that often reduces jitters in people that experience that. I do not, but my partner does. She has a very different experience with tea compared to coffee. I discussed this earlier, but there's a misconception that coffee has more caffeine. Now, in practice, the drink you're gonna have probably does have more caffeine, but tea contains more caffeine than coffee. You just tend to use more coffee when you make coffee. If you brew tea in that high concentration, small amount of water, short brew time, lots of steeps, that method that I talked about, which is what I would recommend doing, you will get a lot. You're using a more similar amount of tea. You are getting a lot of caffeine when you do that. I think you should share that or be very careful to eat plenty while you do it. That is better, more comfortable. And I wouldn't recommend doing that more than once a day. I think people could have less caffeine maybe, broadly, but I'm a weird sample. I've observed people, maybe more objectively, how caffeine is affecting them from my perception, but I also haven't really experienced this feeling myself of coffee really waking me up. So take my suggestion with a grain of salt. It's just a different perspective. It's not more or less right or wrong. It's just somebody looking from the outside with a different frame of reference. It seems to me like a lot of people would be happier if they had a different relationship with coffee, tea, but also caffeine. Now, I would briefly like to talk about my experiences with getting a bit high from caffeine in a very unpleasant way. Because I don't feel much of any effect from caffeine when I drink it, it doesn't stimulate me, and I get very good sleep, so it doesn't make me sleepy. Caffeine makes most people briefly sleepy. Chemically, it blocks certain receptors in your brain, will temporarily make you a bit sleepy, but then wake you up. I am well rested most of the time, so thankfully I don't really feel that, and it doesn't make me feel more awake. I can have too much caffeine a bit more easily than some people. And after I have maybe 4 servings of caffeine, whatever that is, a meaningfully sized cup of coffee or a drink made with a shot of espresso or a session brewing tea that way I described, which all have ballpark similar amounts of caffeine, in the ballpark of 1 to 200 grams of caffeine. Let's say that. Neither I nor the people making these products know, so that's just a wild guess. Once I've had 3, 4 servings of that, I start to feel really, really bad, very depressed, kind of, it's hard to describe, like a little floaty, heavy. And I don't do this purposefully, of course, just very occasionally, maybe 3 times in my life. I've felt that feeling because I wasn't keeping track of it as well. So just like with all things, alcohol, know your dose. one incentive to make it yourself is that you know how much of it you're getting a lot better than if you didn't make it yourself. The delicious coffee flavored convection beverage thing. This can really hide coffee, very much like a mixed drink and alcohol. And this is fine if you know your dose, which you usually don't when you get that kind of drink. It's designed to make it hard to know that. So that is a small recommendation. If you're sensitive to caffeine, you have a strong motivation to be making it yourself because you can manipulate that. And you can see the exact difference with different kinds of caffeinated drinks. Again, your L-theanine tea versus coffee. A lot of people report feeling quite different when drinking pu'er compared to normal unaged tea. Some people in some parts of Yunnan, where a lot of pu'er is made, they don't drink pu'er younger than 15 years because supposedly this kind of headache feeling you can get from it goes away by then. Anecdotally, that has been true for me. I don't know why. What's happening there? I don't know. Anyway, and it doesn't happen with all young pu'er for me. I don't know. I don't know, but that is a thing I've had. People describe getting tea drunk as well. Pretty sure you're just high on caffeine. I don't think there's a separate thing going on there, but I don't know. It definitely feels different to me. Again, I think because it doesn't make me feel wakeful, it's easier to pair apart the specific differences in the experiences for me, maybe, or I'm just placeboing myself into oblivion. I don't know. But it could be worth a shot. So that's my little thing on caffeine. As I have a low opinion of this subject, I don't have a lot of strong recommendations for that, but I hope I was able to say something useful, if cynical. There's nothing wrong with consuming caffeine if that's what's going on with you. I just feel like it's good to take a critical eye to how it can be best utilized. That's all. Um, and to focus on that. Zez, in your Parley request, you said, what other properties do you think are undervalued and overvalued? And I feel like I kind of said that a lot indirectly, but directly, I do have a few things to say too. I didn't come out as strong as I feel about the really weird, I said kind of masturbatorily different tea and coffee. Some of the very high-end ones are just obnoxiously weird, in my opinion. Like, they not even good, very unbalanced, just loud and different. And usually you get not that much of them. Sure. I tasted a coffee from Colombia that had this kind of, okay, so the texture, very heavy body. It was kind of chewy, like a brownie. It had that feeling. Really good. I hope that sounds good. The flavor note was like white raisins. It was, yeah, like, there's a dessert called a turtle, or kind of like a molassesy cookie thing, or some like oatmeal raisin cookies. It had that area of flavor with that texture. That was weird. It felt like it was trying to play act being a pastry, but I just wanted to eat a brownie. And I don't really want my coffee to taste of raisins. I'm not sure a lot of people do. Why? So I don't know. I've had more of a problem with that in coffee personally. I just really want to double down on that point. I feel like the aggressive whack of acid, it's very different. Humans like balances of acid, sweet, salt, fat, that thing. I'm sure there are people who really like those hyper acidic, not sour, not wrongly brewed, but just very acid forward coffees. But I kind of feel like they're doing them for their own. It's like because we can, you know. I don't know. I that frustrates me a little bit. I kind of feel like the beautiful thing I pitched at the very beginning of this video is humans have put a lot of effort into delicious coffee and tea. I feel like this has gone a bit far past that to a goal that I'm not sure how valuable I would agree that is. But maybe I'm being annoying and people should just have their fun. And most coffee and tea are not like this. But sometimes I drink a coffee or a tea and I think, but why? Like, why did you do this? Like, does anybody like this? I would really love to mind read the researchers who made these things and say, but do you think this is good or are you just being annoying? Like, you made a tea that tastes like camphor. But, like, why? You know? Okay, anyway, that's my. you can get novelty by buying normal ones. Okay, I'll shut up now. Thank you for asking this question I had a lot to say about.